It's one of the biggest questions in human history. Who were the first people to set foot in the Americas? For a long time, we thought we had a simple, neat answer. But that answer's fallen apart. The story today is messier, more complex, and much, much older than we ever imagined. It's a detective story played out over millennia, with clues buried in mud, frozen in ice, and encoded in our own DNA. To understand where we are now, you have to understand the old story, the one that was taught in schools for most of the 20th century. It was called the Clovis-First model, and for a good while it made perfect sense. The story starts during the last ice age. Much of the world's water was locked up in massive continental glaciers. This made sea levels much lower than they are today. So low, in fact, that a vast landmass connected Asia and North America. It wasn't a narrow bridge. It was a huge, sprawling subcontinent called Beringia. It stretched for 1,000 miles, a cold, dry, treeless plain roamed by woolly mammoths, steppe bison, and horses. The Clovis-First theory said that a group of big game hunters from Siberia followed these animals across Beringia and into Alaska. And so they were trapped there for a while by two giant ice sheets, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran, which covered almost all of Canada. But around 13,500 years ago, as the climate warmed, a path opened up between these glaciers. An ice-free corridor. These pioneering people, the theory went, walked down this corridor into the heart of North America. And once they broke free of the ice, they found a paradise, a continent teeming with giant animals that had never seen a human hunter before. They spread like wildfire. Within a few hundred years, they had populated all of North and South America, right down to the tip of Chile. This story had a powerful piece of evidence to back it up. All across North America, archaeologists started finding a particular type of stone spear point. It was beautifully made, with a characteristic groove, or flute, at the base where it was hafted onto a wooden shaft. They were named Clovis points, after the town in New Mexico where they were first identified in the 1930s, found alongside the bones of mammoths. The Clovis point was like a archaeological calling card. Everywhere archaeologists looked, from Pennsylvania to Arizona, they found them. And they were all dated to a very narrow window of time between about 13,000 to 212,900 years ago. It was the first widespread identifiable culture in the Americas. The evidence seemed clear. The Clovis people were the first Americans. They arrived, they spread, and they conquered a continent. It was a tidy, compelling narrative. For decades, the Clovis-First model was scientific dogma. If an archaeologist claimed to have found evidence of people in the Americas before Clovis, they were met with extreme skepticism. The gatekeepers of the field, sometimes called the Clovis police, would demand impeccable, undeniable evidence. And for a long time, no site could meet that high bar. Claims of pre-Clovis settlements would be picked apart. And the stone tools were just naturally broken rocks, they'd say. The charcoal from the fire pit was from a natural wildfire. The dating was wrong. The Clovis wall stood firm, but then came a quiet, muddy creek bed in southern Chile, a place called Monte Verde. In the 1970s, an American archaeologist named Tom Dillehay began excavating at Monte Verde. What he found was stunning. It wasn't just a collection of stone tools. Because the site had been quickly buried in a peat bog, organic materials were perfectly preserved. Dillehay and his team unearthed the remains of wooden huts, stone hearths lined with clay, and scraps of animal hide. They found digging sticks, spear tips, and grinding stones. They found bits of edible and medicinal plants, some of which had come from the coast, 40 miles away. They even found a child's footprint preserved in the soft clay near a hearth. This was a snapshot of daily life, but the most shocking thing about Monte Verde was its age. Dillehay carefully dated the materials using radiocarbon dating. The results were unambiguous. The site was 14,500 years old. That was a full 1,000 years before the first Clovis points appeared. And it was in southern Chile, thousands of miles south of the ice-free corridor. The implications were staggering. If people were living this far south 14,500 years ago, they couldn't have been the Clovis people who came down the ice-free corridor. That corridor wasn't even fully open for travel yet, and even if it were, how could they have traveled the entire length of two continents, adapting to countless new environments in just a few hundred years? It didn't make sense. It meant the entire Clovis-First story was wrong. The archaeological establishment pushed back hard. For 20 years, Dillehay's findings were debated, questioned, and dismissed. He was accused of incompetence and even fraud, but he was meticulous. He kept excavating, documenting everything. Finally, in 1997, a group of prominent Clovis-First archaeologists, the most skeptical of the skeptics, visited Monte Verde themselves. They examined the evidence, looked at the layers of earth, and held the preserved wooden artifacts in their hands. At the end of their visit, they concluded that Dillehay was right, Monte Verde was real. That moment broke the Clovis Wall. It was a paradigm shift in American archaeology. If Monte Verde was real, then other pre-Clovis sites might be real too. Archaeologists started to look again at sites that had been dismissed. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, with dates suggesting human presence over 16,000 years ago. The Paisley Caves in Oregon, where scientists found preserved human DNA in 14,300-year-old dried human feces, known as coprolites. A site in Texas called the Deborah L. Friedkin site, where a whole toolkit of stone blades, much simpler than Clovis points, was found sealed in a layer of sediment dated to over 15,500 years ago. The evidence was piling up. Clovis was not first, people were here long before. Which led to a new giant question. If they didn't come down the ice-free corridor, how did they get here? A new idea began to take hold. One that had been on the fringes for a while, but now seemed to make a lot more sense. It's called the coastal migration theory, or more poetically, the Kelp Highway. The theory goes like this. The first Americans didn't walk. They came by boat. Instead of waiting for a path to open between the glaciers, these early people followed the coastline. During the Ice Age, the Pacific coast of Beringia and the Americas was not covered by the main ice sheets. It was a complex landscape of islands, fjords, and coastal plains, and critically, it was likely a rich environment. The coastal waters would have supported kelp forests, creating a productive ecosystem teeming with fish, seals, sea lions, shellfish, and seabirds. People with boats could have hopscotched their way down this coast. They wouldn't have needed to constantly adapt to new inland environments. They could rely on the same set of marine skills and resources all the way down. This would have been a much faster and easier way to travel than trekking through a barren, icy corridor. It also neatly explains how people could have gotten all the way to Chile by 14,500 years ago. A boat-based migration could be incredibly rapid. The biggest problem with the Kelp Highway theory is finding the evidence. The coastlines that these people would have traveled along are now deep underwater. As the glaciers melted, sea levels rose by more than 300 feet, flooding those ancient beaches and settlement sites. Any direct evidence of this journey, the campsites, the hearths, the discarded tools, is likely lost to the sea. But we are finding tantalizing indirect clues. Archaeologists are looking for very old sites on land that would have been coastal back then. On the Channel Islands off California, they found sophisticated stone points and crescent-shaped tools from around 13,000 years ago, used by people who were clearly hunting waterfowl and marine mammals. In a cave in southeastern Alaska, they found the 10,300-year-old remains of a man who had a diet rich in seafood. Farther south, sites in Peru and Chile show a heavy reliance on marine resources more than 12,000 years ago. It all points to a deep history of coastal living. So the story changed. The first people were likely coastal mariners, not just big game hunters. They arrived earlier than we thought, at least 16,000 years ago, and maybe even earlier. They skirted the ice sheets in small watercraft and worked their way down the coast, a process that took generations but was far faster than the old model allowed. This became the new consensus. It was a more complex picture, but it fit the growing body of evidence. And then a whole new field of science came along and changed everything again: genetics. Scientists learned how to extract and analyze ancient DNA from human remains. By comparing the DNA of ancient skeletons with the DNA of modern indigenous peoples across the Americas, they could build a family tree that stretched back into the deep past. This genetic evidence acts as an independent check on the archaeological story. And it has added some incredible new twists. First, the genetics confirm the big picture. The DNA of all indigenous peoples in the Americas, from the Inuit of the Arctic to the Yaghan of Tierra del Fuego, traces back to a single founding population that originated in Northeast Asia or Siberia. There was no migration from Europe, no lost tribes of Israel. The ancestral homeland was Siberia. But the DNA also revealed a surprise. It suggested that after the ancestors of Native Americans split off from their Asian relatives, they didn't immediately come into the Americas. Instead, they spent thousands of years, maybe as many as 10,000 years, in isolation. This is known as the Beringian standstill hypothesis. It seems the vast land of Beringia wasn't just a bridge. It was a homeland, a place where a population of people lived for a very long time, cut off from Asia by growing glaciers to the west and blocked from the Americas by the massive ice sheets to the east. In this Beringian refuge, they developed the unique genetic signatures that are now found only in Native Americans. They were no longer Siberians, they were becoming the first Americans. Then, sometime after the ice began to melt, they started to move. The genetics show a rapid branching out from this ancestral population. One group went south and became the ancestors of all indigenous people in Central and South America. Another group fanned out into North America. The DNA supports the idea of a swift expansion, which fits well with either a coastal or an inland route. The genetic story adds a rich layer of human drama. It wasn't a quick sprint across a bridge. It was a long, multi-generational epic, a story of a people who survived the harshest period of the Ice Age in a refuge at the top of the world, and then when the world began to warm, became the explorers of two empty continents. But just when the story seemed to be settling into a new consensus, a coastal migration around 16,000 years ago by people who had spent millennia in Beringia, even more radical discoveries began to emerge. Discoveries that could push the timeline back not just by a few thousand years, but by tens of thousands of years. These discoveries are deeply controversial. They are challenging the very definition of what counts as evidence. One of the most provocative is the Cerruti Mastodon site in California. In the 1990s, paleontologists uncovered the remains of a mastodon. The bones were broken in a strange way. There were large stones found next to them that looked like hammerstones and anvils. In 2017, a team of scientists published a paper arguing that the patterns of fracture on the bones and the wear marks on the stones were evidence of humans smashing the bones to get at the marrow. The truly shocking part was the date. The site was dated to 130,000 years ago. This was scientific heresy. 130,000 years ago would mean that some form of early human, maybe Neanderthals or Denisovans, reached the Americas. It would completely rewrite human history. Most archaeologists are extremely skeptical. They argue that the broken bones could have been caused by a mud flow or by other animals trampling them. The tools, they say, are just rocks, not shaped by human hands. The evidence is ambiguous. It's a fascinating possibility, but for now it remains on the far fringes of science. A more recent and more compelling challenge comes from a cave in central Mexico called Chiquihuita Cave. Archaeologists digging deep in the cave floor found hundreds of stone artifacts that look like simple tools. The layers these tools were found in were dated to as far back as 30,000 years ago. This would place people in the Americas right in the middle of the Ice Age, long before the ice-free corridor or a coastal migration were thought possible. But again, the evidence is difficult to interpret. The stone tools are very simple. Critics argue they could be Heufax rocks that have been broken naturally by falling from the cave ceiling, looking like they were made by humans. And crucially, no human DNA has been found in the cave sediments from those ancient layers, though plenty of bear DNA has. The debate over Chiquihuite is intense. If it's real, it changes everything. If it's not, it's a cautionary tale about how easy it is to see patterns in nature. And then came the footprints. In White Sands National Park in New Mexico, ancient human footprints have been known for years. They are preserved in what was once the muddy shore of a long-vanished lake. In 2021, scientists published a stunning paper. They had found a set of these footprints in a layer of sediment that also contained ancient seeds from an aquatic plant. They could radiocarbon date these seeds. The dates came back showing the footprints were between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. This was a bombshell. Unlike ambiguous stone tools, footprints are undeniable evidence of people. You can't have a geofact footprint. These were tracks of teenagers and children walking along a lakeshore thousands of years before the ice sheets in the north had even begun to melt. This evidence is much harder to dismiss. The main debate now centers on the dating. Could the old carbon from the lake water have contaminated the seeds, making them seem older than they are? The research team says they've accounted for this, and the dates are solid. Other teams are now working to date the sediment layers themselves using different methods. But if the 23,000-year-old date holds, it is a game changer. It means people were in New Mexico during the last glacial maximum, the absolute coldest, harshest period of the Ice Age. It means they somehow got south of the massive ice sheets long before we thought it was possible. How did they do it? When did they arrive? Were they part of the same population that became the ancestors of modern Native Americans, or were they a completely separate, earlier migration that died out? A. Lowest population of the Americas. These questions are now at the forefront of the research. The White Sands footprints have forced everyone to think about radical new possibilities. Maybe people arrived 30,000 years ago or more during a warmer period before the glaciers reached their maximum extent. Maybe they lived in small, scattered groups for millennia, their sparse archaeological signature almost impossible to find. So, who were the first people in the Americas? The simple answer is we don't know for sure. The story has been blown wide open, but we can piece together a new, emerging narrative. It's no longer a single story, but a series of overlapping possibilities. The old Clovis-First story is dead. That much is certain. The story of the Kelp Highway mariners arriving around 16,000 to 18,000 years ago is now the most widely accepted conservative model. It's backed by solid archaeological sites like Monte Verde and a wealth of genetic data connecting these people to the Beringian standstill population and modern indigenous groups. This migration was almost certainly the one that led to the pupilling of the entire hemisphere and gave rise to the great diversity of cultures and peoples who were here when Europeans arrived. These are the direct ancestors. Then there is the deeper story, hinted at by White Sands and Chiquihuite Cave. This story suggests a much earlier presence, perhaps as far back as 25,000 or 30,000 years ago. These people would have been true Ice Age survivors, living in a world of glaciers and megafauna we can barely imagine. We don't know if they survived to contribute their genes to later populations. They might have been a ghost lineage, a people who pioneered the continent but ultimately vanished, leaving only faint traces like footprints in the mud. The connection between these potential very early people and the later, genetically confirmed ancestors is the biggest mystery we now face. And finally, there's the truly ancient speculative story from places like the Cerruti Mastodon site. The idea of a 130,000-year-old presence is still far from proven and is not accepted by the scientific community. But it reminds us to keep an open mind. We have been wrong before. Our understanding of the past is constantly changing with each new discovery. What we've lost is a simple, straightforward story. What we've gained is something far more profound. The peopling of the Americas was not a single event, but a long, complex process that may have happened in multiple waves by different peoples over a vast stretch of time. It's a story about human resilience and ingenuity. It's about people in small boats navigating icy coastlines. It's about families leaving footprints on a muddy shore in a world of mammoths. It's about a people who survived for millennia in an Arctic refuge and then explored and settled two continents, from the frozen north to the fiery south, adapting and thriving. The people who did this weren't just a handful of big game hunters. They were explorers, innovators, and ancestors. The question, who were they, is not just about dates and artifacts. It's about understanding the origins of the tens of millions of indigenous people who live in the Americas today. Their history did not begin 13,000 years ago. It began much, much earlier, in a deep past that we are only now beginning to uncover, one footprint, one stone tool, one fragment of DNA at a time. The final chapter of this story has not yet been written.